Sri Aurobindo has been describing the stages and means for freeing ourselves from the ego consciousness. And in the chapter that we have just completed, step by step, he takes us through various gradations and degrees of freedom from the ego consciousness. In the last stage of this concentrated effort on the one and infinite, we came to this possibility that one could withdraw into the silence of the self to such a degree that the world itself begins to appear dreamlike or illusory because of the nature of the consciousness which is experiencing the self. And he points out that this is not all. That the reality is that nature, which now seems dreamlike, unreal, is moving with self as her Lord. And it is possible to re-establish the right relation with this nature from the poise of the self by a process which he says that we shall hereafter describe. And that's the theme of the present chapter which we are now beginning. In the liberated consciousness, though, as Sri Aurobindo describes in the last portion, there is no more an ego sense. There is the perception of the one everywhere, and when this perception is complete and permanent, the individualized consciousness lives in the truth of the cosmic play, even in full action, even in possession of the lower being. The jiva remains still one with the Lord, and there is no bondage and no delusion. He is in possession of self and released from the ego. This was the end of the previous chapter. Now, getting to this stage, how do we re-establish the relationship between self and the world? And that is the theme of the chapter we are now beginning, titled The Realization of the Cosmic Self. Here, Sri Aurobindo shifts perspective. So far in the journey, we were as if from our human consciousness looking upwards towards that. And the entire focus was on what do you place your concentration? In what way do you ascend? In what way do you free yourself from the false identification with the body, with the life energy, with the emotions, with the thoughts, with the mind itself? How do we disengage from this, and on what do we place our attention? So this has been the direction of the perspective and the effort. But now the position reverses itself. we have, through such a process, reached some kind of a closeness to the self. Ideally, we have reached an experience of the self sufficiently stable, but to whatever degree we have been able to realize, from that position now we turn around and turn to the world. If we have gone into that extreme, as is the object of certain traditions, where we enter into the silence of the self, the world looks distant, illusory, and now we turn to look upon this illusory and distant world and re-establish the right relation. First of all, is there such a thing possible? If it is possible, what is the basis of this right relation? And when that relation is set, how is it set? And when it is set, what happens? What does one experience? How does one function and act in the world? This is the overall theme of this chapter. Briefly, he recapitulates what we have done so far in our study and to a degree at least in our practice. Now we may say at this point, before we proceed, is this even relevant for us? We can all say quite freely that we have not attained to that pure silence of the self. And even if we have had glimpses of it to whatever degree, they are not the highest station of an absolute consciousness. And so shouldn't we wait before we proceed? There are three reasons why we need not wait. First, that the mind understanding the overall scheme, the overall path, being convinced of it, already begins a process. There's a very deep truth which is relied upon in the yoga, especially in the integral yoga, the truth of what is called faith. Faith not as a belief, but as a profound knowing of the soul. We know that we exist. We know that we can do this. We know that life has a meaning or a purpose. And in spite of all external beliefs imposed upon us, this knowing survives because it is not a constructed belief system, it is an innate knowing of our essential consciousness. It is this and from this that all of the highest possibilities and realizations emerge. Because somewhere deep within us, we know that we are one with the self, with the divine, that we are a part of that. Therefore, when the mind starts thinking about it, aspires to know, when the heart yearns for the divine and closeness with the divine, it is possible to attain to that. Because somewhere deep within us, we already are one with that in the essence of our inmost faith. And so when we study this, when we read this, Sri Aurobindo places in rational terms experiences which are profound and properly belong to our deepest consciousness. The mind opens and accepts, but there is a resonance with our deepest parts. And it assists in bringing forward that innate faith of the experience, and through that, the experience itself begins to come forward. And so this brings us to the second reason why it is important to continue to study. Because when we so approach this text, then as we read and as we open ourselves and identify to whatever degree with the experiences described, it prepares the ground and begins the process, initiates the realization of that. However slowly, however partially, but it begins the process. And that is an immense aid. We are fortunate not to have been asked by a guru to go into the forest and meditate until we find the self. We wouldn't know where to start, we wouldn't know what the self is, and perhaps years are spent simply in gaining a first glimpse. And then it is very easy to stop short and say, this is it. But here, as the framework is being developed and the full picture is being revealed, something deep within us feels as if a thirst quenched, a deep knowing being awakened, and the full perspective emerging. Already the process begins, and we know how far one has to go, and we do not stop halfway. The experience itself begins to dawn. The third reason for studying this is because what we will do from that highest station of the Absolute, turning back upon the world and reconnecting on a new foundation, that action must be repeated at each stage of the ascent, to whatever degree is relevant and possible at that point. Of course, the true embracement of the whole world is possible when we are in a consciousness which transcends the world and is free completely. Then from that complete freedom we can embrace it all without ever being entangled and attached. But in between, as we ascend, as our consciousness grows more free, more wide, more true, at each step we are required to turn upon the world and our daily life and re-establish our relationships with all things. And so what will be described here as something to be done from that highest station will be applied by us at each stage, beginning with where we are today. Already in the consciousness in which we live today, to whatever extent we are already entangled, there are parts in us which are not entangled. Sometimes those parts come forward sharply and suddenly the whole world feels not really worthwhile. Something is wrong, something is not okay, something is unreal. Even in our more idealistic mental parts, we find the condition of the world so disturbing. Why is there so much darkness, so much suffering? This is not true, it is a false appearance. And so there are parts, even in the mind, which can glimpse such things, even before we have an experience of the self. But from that poise where we see the world to be not what it appears to be, how then do we engage with the world? And these questions are resolved in the text we are reading now. Of course, if we approach it from a mental consciousness, it will only be a partial and half-true relationship. But still, the need to re-establish at each step a new relationship is essential in all evolution. Sri Aurobindo even describes the process of evolution thus in another text, which he describes it as having 10 stages. At each stage, as a new consciousness is awakened and developed, it must turn upon all that has been developed in the past, re-establish a new relationship with all those levels, and then only can go to the next step. And from there, again, it has to review all the relationships and re-establish and rebuild. And again go one step higher, again go down and re-establish all the relationships. It's as if when human beings awakened to the mental consciousness, we suddenly looked back, this is the body, it's still half ape. And then you re-establish the relationship with the body. My relationship with society, which is still half animal, is now re-established on the basis of the mind. My emotions, which were good enough as they were for a stable animal life, now have to be refined and raised to higher mental values. The way I eat the food, the kind of food I eat, all of these are changing. The sounds I make, speech and so on. And the clothes we wear, it might have been all right to have had large fur to begin with. We might have covered ourselves with bark or whatever. But there is a mental value which now has to review all these to the tiniest detail. And if this has to happen at each step, even of our mental development, even more so it must be true from the awakening to the consciousness of self. And the extent of the recasting is so enormous that everything is changed permanently. And that's why we have this phrase, reversal of consciousness. It's as if everything becomes upside down compared to the values which were before. So we, having understood the value of reading this for 3 reasons, we begin the text. The realization of the cosmic self. Our first imperative aim when we draw back from mind, life, body, and all else that is not our eternal being, is to get rid of the false idea of self, by which we identify ourselves with the lower existence, and can realize only our apparent being as perishable or mutable creatures in a perishable or ever mutable world. So, we're drawing back from mind, life and body. That has been part of the practice before. And all else that is not our eternal being. We put concentration wholly on the one eternal, infinite self. And you're drawing back. You could continue to draw back and say this is it and stop there. Since we have to turn around eventually and re-establish relationships, we are looking at this world now. What was it that we lived in before? We identified ourselves with this existence, lower compared to that which is higher. And we knew ourselves as perishable, mutable creatures in a world which is perishable or ever mutable. Now, why is he taking trouble to give 2 words, perishable or mutable? Perishable or mutable, both for ourselves and for the world. Because depending on the various philosophies, perspectives, one can look upon the universe as a permanent reality. It is there eternally, but ever changing. Or there are equally philosophies, as modern science currently finds it fashionable, to say there was a beginning, there was a Big Bang that took place 14 billion years ago. And there will be a big crunch eventually. So it will perish, it has a beginning, it has to end. But there are also other theories which, well, there can never be a beginning. Because you can say 14 billion years ago there was a Big Bang, but what happened 15 billion years ago before the Big Bang? There was something, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't have time, you wouldn't have space in which the Big Bang takes place. And if you say the Big Bang itself creates time and space, then the Big Bang does not begin 14 billion years ago. You cannot have it inside time. It creates time and therefore stands outside time and is an eternal reality. So philosophically there are problems. You cannot say this so simply that the world has a beginning and an end. Or you say it is a permanent reality having swings of movements of expansion and collapse. But all of these possibilities are taken into account. Common to all of this is change, instability, some kind of an extinction. Forms die out even if world continues. And this has been the character of what has been described as the lower existence. Contrasted with the higher existence which is permanent, self, unchanging, immutable, cannot find even something to move or change. It simply is pure awareness. And this has been what we have identified with. So our first imperative aim when we draw back is to get rid of the false idea of self by which we identified with this changing appearance. What was this false idea of self? When I say, I know who I am, what am I? I am this changing, mutable, perishable self. How did I get into this false idea? I don't know, but I need to get free of it. And that's the first imperative aim as we draw back. So the whole focus, as you see, as we concentrate towards the self, is to concentrate on the immutability of the one and infinite and draw back from this false identification. It's not enough to draw back from the false, you have to identify with the true thing which you are. So, we have to know ourselves as the self, the spirit, the eternal. We have to exist consciously in our true being. Therefore, this must be our primary, if not our first, one and all absorbing idea and effort in the path of knowledge. Remember, we are still pursuing the path of knowledge integrally. And so for this purpose, to identify ourselves with the true being, spirit and eternal, the eternal, to be conscious of it, in it, is the first focus. Now what is meant by exist consciously in our true being? And the idea is, we already exist in our true being, unconsciously. Who am I? I am this body, this person that you're looking at, which has to die at some point. I have identified myself with this, but there are parts within which are identified with other layers. I am also mind. I am also this very high abstract part of the mind which has great ideals and which feels itself eternal, permanent. It feels like I will never die. And then there are parts of which I am not conscious, but which are conscious parts. And in those, I am already one with the self. That's why Sri Aurobindo avoids the use of the general word subconscious or unconscious in the Freudian framework. Everything which we are not conscious of is relegated to the unconscious. But Sri Aurobindo says these layers which we are not conscious of are not unconscious. Yes, there is a huge unconscious lower portion, but these layers are even behind the current awareness and they are fully conscious in themselves. And then there are layers above which are super conscious to us. So for us, as if they are unconscious, but they are super conscious and they are aware of themselves and they are aware of us and of the whole cosmos, and it is still a part of us. So if you had to draw a picture of the human being, you would say, yes, there's this body. You would draw the subtle layers beyond, the subtle physical, the vital, the mental, and larger, but becoming almost mist-like, fainter and fainter, is this consciousness which is immense and joins with the whole universe. Seen from the other perspective, it is the one consciousness which is the whole universe and which transcends the whole universe, which kinds of swings into a focus, narrowing to form these denser gradations of substance, mind, life, subtle physical, gross physical, and then plugs into the biology of the baby, which is about to take birth, and the tip point identifies here. What is our reality? This whole massive, we can picture it as a cone of consciousness, massive, infinite, one. The self, the spirit, the eternal, on one extreme, and then narrowing into a focus in its frontal, mutable mind, life, body front. Somebody asked this question to Sri Aurobindo, I think it is in the evening talks. He said, "Sir, are we God?" Because that's the way in which we are taught as children, we are all essentially that, but the essential word is forgotten. Sri Aurobindo answers, in a sense, we are the tail end of God. The tail end. Tail end. If you have a big creature, let's say a dinosaur, and the tail end and the tip is us. So God is okay, not a creature, this massive, immense, one infinite consciousness. And from there, as if it puts out a little body and tail, and the tip of the tail is this little person that says, ooh, what is this? I'm born here in this world. I'm this separate person. Oh my God, I'm scared of the world. I need to defend myself. And this little tip of the tail end here. But if it could turn upon itself and say, where is this sense of I am aware comes from? Turn in and chase it backwards. It's like you pursue back all the way until you come back to the whole. This is the method of self-inquiry of Ramana Maharshi, where he keeps asking, ask yourself, who are you? So if you look at the human being in this sense, there is a part of us that is already that. Only we are not conscious of that, we do not live in that. So that's why he uses this very suggestive phrase, we have to exist consciously in our true being, where we currently exist subconsciously. So the only way I can enter that is by kind of a swoon of trance where this consciousness, which is unable to get to that, goes to sleep, and some part of me identifies with that. Briefly, I come back, reawaken the surface consciousness with no memory except some vague, faint impression left. But to exist consciously in our true being is to recognize this whole continuity of consciousness and awake in that. And from there, of course, you have everything, all the way to the most superficial parts of our consciousness. So we have to know ourselves as the self, the spirit, the eternal. We have to exist consciously in our true being. Therefore, this must be our primary, if not our first and all-absorbing idea and effort in the path of knowledge. To become, to realize, to become aware of that. Get rid of false idea of self, get to true self. But when we have realized the eternal self that we are, when we have become true relation, when we have become this when we have become that inalienably, we have still a secondary aim to establish the true relation between this eternal self that we are and the mutable existence and mutable world which till now we had falsely taken for our real being and our sole possible status. So till now, in this approach, from the tail end of God to God, we were more aware of ourselves as we enter that. But once we reach that position and from there we look back, we see not only there is this concentration into individual self, but there is equally concentration into world, which emerges from there. So self, individual self and world, both are equally unreal, mutable, perishable, false appearances with which we now have to re-establish some relationship. So this becomes a secondary aim, the true relationship between the eternal self and the mutable existence and world. But what was it before? Earlier we had a false relation with it. Now we have to get back a true relation. Because that relationship was false, we had to get out of that relationship. And now that we have a basis in a truth of who we are, we have to re-establish a true relationship. So the logic is very simple. The problem is, how do you do that? Because that seems to appear unreal and even impossibly false. Now Sri Aurobindo continues very rationally. In order that there should be any real relation, it must be a relation between two realities. Now you can have lots of false relations with unrealities. You can start a daydream. I am now king of the world. I am now executing orders. They are doing this or that, whatever it is, your current fantasy. And what you have created as a fantasy is unreal. And you have a relationship with that. That being unreal, the relationship also is unreal. You may say it is true to myself, but it's as good as saying that I will say my body is myself. Yes, it's true to myself, but it's not a reality, it's not a truth. And so you're accepting a falsehood as a truth, doesn't make it true. Since the whole basis for us was to find a fundamental truth, and found ourselves there, from there now we look upon the world. Unless there is some truth in the world, you cannot establish a true relationship with it. So there has to be two things which are true, only then the relationship can be true. If you take a falsehood and call it truth and set a relationship with it, we call it delusion, illusion, getting lost in a fantasy. This is the term used even in the traditions of our experience of the world. It is a delusion. And because we live in a delusion, we suffer, we experience pain, we experience decay, death, ignorance and so on, which belong to the falseness. Because it is false, it must break down eventually. Because it is false, it is always unstable and changing. So we are using words of true and false, but we need to define what that means. Yes. Yes. Mhm. Right. Yes. 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 When you look at a life situation, as you've described, you're working on your body consciousness, you're working, exercising, running, you have already identified yourself with body saying, I am body, or I am mind having a body, even that is much better. And then you're putting an attention on a part in order to develop it. You are operating in the domain of relativities. In the domain of relativities, there are relative truths and relative falsehoods. At that point, for you to say, I am one with the body, would be relative falsehood compared to saying, I am one with the mind. Who is making the effort of identifying? Mind. So you are more mind than body. When your mind identifies body, you can say, yes, right now I am one with my muscle. But who is one with the muscle? Mind. So you are operating in the domain of relative truths, where this is being modified, relationships are being modified, it's all fine. It's all good, it's all useful on a pragmatic level. But to then say, when my body dies, I will die with it, would be an error. Because you are not body. Yes. 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 So the mind can drive the body to any extent. The body itself has limitations of the biology beyond which the muscles will start tearing. Okay? And then there is life force, which does not have the same limitation as the biology. Life force itself can drive far more. So you will see there are situations you're running, you're exhausted, and then suddenly there's a burst of fresh energy. You get second breath. And it does not come from inside you, it comes as if from outside. At that point, the body, which has a habit of a certain relationship and balance with life energy, used to operating with only this much energy, it has reached a point of exhaustion, and as if the boundary of that relationship collapses. And suddenly it opens out to a deeper relationship with life force, and it can take in far more. One can train oneself to break that boundary and re-establish the relationship with universal life force to such a degree that you will never get tired. Biology may get exhausted and break down, but you will not be tired. To that extent you can go. And sometimes people do that when they are exercising, often with the mind. They rise above the body sensation and just infuse energy. You can go on doing an exercise until your muscle tears, and still you don't need to stop. That's the kind of energy you can drive. And people who work on the body, they have experienced these things. So all of this really belongs to a domain where you are playing with relationships of 2 or 3 layers. A higher truth operating on a lower truth and modifying its limitations. But if you continue this process and you want to get to the highest truth, from which you will have the greatest power to modify and re-establish relationships, then we would go all the way to the self. Mind itself is a particular formulation of the self, as is life energy, as is even physical substance and body. And if the power of the self can now be turned upon this, as mind could change the body's limits, the self can enormously amplify and liberate completely all the limitations of the physical, vital or mental consciousness. The scope of that is potentially unlimited. And it is in this direction that evolution is pushing us. But evolution is doing it slowly. To get us to the point where mind becomes master of the body, it's taken so many millions of years. But once mind has become capable, it can say, now I know where this train is going, and I speed up the process. I don't need to wait 1 million years, I can do it in one lifetime. And so that's the part where we get into yoga proper. But the same principle of shifting relationship between mind and body is now being brought in to shift relation from self with mind and from self with body. Self then will look upon mind and infuse its power into mind, its knowledge and its light into mind. And mind itself will become now not a vehicle of partial knowledge where it is operating in black and white shadows and mirrors, but it will become an instrument of light of self. It will be an instrument of perfect knowledge. The life force in us, which is currently a narrow, small bit, an engine which can operate only in 50 volts, 100 volts, anything more it will burn out. That life energy can open out and become a vehicle for the power of the self to manifest. The body itself as substance, which is currently a substance of complete ignorance and even to a great degree subconsciousness, unconsciousness, can be made fully awakened to the spirit and self and become a vehicle for a perfect, transparent beauty of Sachidananda to manifest. And this is really the framework that Sri Aurobindo places before us. He says all of these instruments are temporarily our vehicles in the framework of their current evolutionary development. As we grow in consciousness, the vehicle itself has to be recast at each step, turning upon and changing and changing. To make mind a vehicle for the knowledge of the self, with no ignorance at all, a divine knowledge, perfect, fully lit and open, is not as difficult as making the body consciousness so transformed. Top down, the consciousness is more plastic. Going down, it is less plastic. And that's why the transformation begins top down. But by what power will you transform? You could begin to transform with your higher faculties of mind. For example, when you're exercising your body, what are you doing? You're turning your mind on the body and saying, all right, my muscle is only this much, my DNA is only so developed. I will now, by training, make it do far more than it can. Same with the emotions, we master them, change them, reshape them completely. I was once a cantankerous, angry, jealous, petty person, and now I have completely recast myself. It's all possible. Who's doing it? Mind and some higher part of the mind. And in the same way, the mind can also reshape its own faculties. My intelligence currently is whatever, and now by a certain process of training, I increase my intelligence. I increase my power of visualization, imagination, creativity, and so on. But still, who is doing it? Some part of the mental I. That poise of I itself can now rise one step above. It can become one with not just a rational mind of the buddhi, intellect, but rise above to an intuitive awareness, rise above to a larger, almost universalized consciousness, which is still I, and rise above all the way to self eventually. And from each poise it can turn back, recast mind, recast life force, recast the body, and change completely at each step the relationship with the whole world.
Collectively, rather, the mind has, it has huge amount of potential and it has surpassed.
Yes.
But individually speaking, for a person, if he needs to shape himself mentally, he may be physically and mentally stronger, mentally he needs to develop. What do you think should be a good start for him to rather get himself to the higher?
I would actually disagree when you say collectively we can do a lot. Collectively we can do less than we can individually. Okay. But to expand the potential of the mind individually, there are many methods, many techniques, and there are entire systems which are dedicated to doing such things. If you look at the mother's commentary on the Dhammapada, a Buddhist text, which she takes up, and she took that up in the playground with the students when she found that there was not enough interest among the students for their own self-culturing. So she said, all right, let's follow a structure. And she comments on each of those verses and describes how to put it into practice. You'll find there a training program. And it starts with things like, you will not speak falsehood. And you ask yourself, why? My mind's skill is that I can deceive anybody. Isn't it? It's a great skill. I want to develop it to be successful in the world. But it will take you only so far. To bring about the full power of the mind, which would be to access all knowledge without limits and without distortion, then your power of expression of the knowledge itself should not have the habit of distorting. If your substance of mind is used to distorting, then you can never access higher knowledge and receive it in truth. In the very reception, it will get distorted. So now you have to cultivate the mind itself, mind substance, mind consciousness, remove from it wrong habits, cultivate right habits, and that process is a whole culturing. It's a full-time job. It means you have to change the way you think, the way you look at the world, and so on. And there are many starting points. Like this would be one starting point. Another simple starting point would be you start training yourself not to see only one from one viewpoint but from many viewpoints. Start training yourself every time you make a statement or you think this is true, consider its opposite and see where that is true and where it becomes untrue. And equally where this was true and where this becomes untrue. Placing the two together, formulate a larger truth which includes the truth of these two and frees from the limitations of both. Having done that, you have cultivated your mind now to see from a more comprehensive perspective. The moment you have got this, look at its limitations and what it is complementing to truth, its limitations, and form a larger. You see, if you train your mind like this, very quickly, you have some plasticity of mind. So very quickly, within a few months, you will find you can look at any situation, justify it and contradict it as you choose. But you will use it now for a greater good. You will not only justify its strengths, you will point out its limitations and show how to complete and complement and get to a bigger picture. And all this will be power of mind still. And just with this, one can go very far in life and reach the peaks of human capacity in humanity. It doesn't take much to do that. But we are aiming at something even greater. But you see, all of these different approaches are useful to prepare, to make the mind a receptive instrument so that with a plastic and wide perspective of mind, when the higher knowledge comes, it can just go and settle straight. Currently, when the mind is not developed, the higher knowledge coming in has to kind of squeeze itself into a limited bowl and gets limited, gets distorted in the process. You get something nice, but it's not the thing that came. You've already lost it in the very act of receiving in the mind. So all of these methods are good, useful. Sri Aurobindo offers the most direct, comprehensive method because our goal is also much more comprehensive. So you can take a look at what he has to say for in the development of intuition. There's a whole chapter in the synthesis of yoga. But otherwise, take a look at Mother's little booklet called The Four Austerities and the Four Liberations. She gives a complete program for a normal person in normal life, whatever you may be doing. For the body, these are the things. For your vital being, these are the things. For the mind, these are the things. Put them into practice, all of them. Starting with the easiest and working towards eventually getting it all. If you just do that much, no other special effort of realizing self, you will find already you will reach extraordinary possibilities. But it's a full-time program and it's something you must say, yes, I want to develop my full potential. Otherwise, you take bits of it, you go as far as you feel comfortable and then it fades out. You'll enjoy that. It's a very small booklet. You can read it in 1 hour even. But each of the points you make a note and then start putting them into practice bit by bit. So from this perspective now, we are trying to re-establish our relationship with all of our parts and the world. So for any real relation, it must be relation between two realities. Yes, it's obvious now. But still we are saying this is real and that is false, or unreal, or less real, or this is more real and that is less real. What do we mean by real and not real? And the point needs to be understood. It's not, I could say, well, self is real, world is unreal. Someone else will say, no, world is real, self is unreal. We could play on, debate. But there has to be some criteria to recognize what we mean by reality. What makes my fantasy unreal or less real? The principle here is that which is real exists by its own reference. It does not need something else to justify it, to prove it, or offer a base on which it can exist. That is real. What is not real? needs something else as a support, and when that support goes, it collapses. Very simply, let's say I have a belief system. I believe that, take up many of the teachings in various religions. When I believe that such and such a thing exists, God is sitting on a throne and He's going to punish me someday. All right. What's the truth of it? Where is the validation, the evidence for it? Well, it says so in this book or in that person's teaching or in that belief, whatever it is. Take out that and the whole idea collapses. This flower is real. Whether I look at it and recognize it or not, it continues to be there. But now you can peel off layers of the reality. When I look deeper with my microscope, I say, well, it's not really flower, it's a bundle of genes operating. I peel off another layer and I say, it's not genes, it is a bundle of energy which is moving and in continuous movement. I peel off another layer and so on. You have degrees of reality. Which is more permanent? That is more real. So the surface of the flower is changing day to day, but the genetic basis of it and the push of the life force is more real, more true than the current temporary appearance of the way I see it. In fact, I could say the way I see it is not completely real. The bee that comes sees the flower differently because it sees also in infrared. The snake sees, the bee sees in ultraviolet. The snake sees in infrared. They are seeing a wider range of colors than I see. So my perception already is limited. And so reality itself is a manifold, multi-layered, multifaceted truths. And so we have many levels of reality and degrees of reality. But the reference of what is more real or less real is it exists by itself, without needing external support or validation for its existence. So what is it that lasts? The appearance of the flower depends on air, water, sunlight. Withdraw that, the flower will fade. The genetic imprint of it perhaps can survive longer. The life force in it can withdraw, come back, push back. The moment the water fades out, it withdraws. The water comes back, the life force pushes again and rebuilds the plant. That is more real. Go back to the impulse behind the life force, what guides it, that is even more real. And so on, one can go peeling off layers. And eventually you come to something which can withdraw from all form completely and then imprint itself once again into form. But even when withdrawn from form, it is, when it comes back into form, it never changes. It is permanent. So the thing which is permanent, self-existent, is the real, capital R. Everything else is in the domain of relativity, less real and even less real and even less real. So when now we use the word real and unreal, we understand what we mean by it. That's why Sri Aurobindo, instead of saying unreal, which would not be true because flower is real, it's a different layer of reality, transitional, so mutable surface appearance. So he uses the word mutable existence, mutable world, or he uses the word perishable creatures, perishable world. And the word perishable or mutable tells you it is a lower, less stable appearance of reality. Essential reality is permanent, self, spirit, eternal, self-existent, not dependent on other things in a chain of cause and effect. It is causeless, and it is the original cause of all things. So, in order that there should be any real relation, it must be a relation between two realities. Self being real, what about world? What is real in it? When everything is perishable, everything is changing. How do you establish a real relationship? So now he looks at how we used to look at it and now how we need now to review the world so that we can establish a real relationship. Formerly, we had thought the eternal self to be a remote concept, far from our mundane existence. if not an illusion and an unreality. Because in the nature of things, we could not conceive of ourselves as anything except this mind, life, and body, changing and moving in the succession of time. So, this is our condition. We cannot think of ourselves as anything else, and we are moving in time. Therefore, self was a remote concept, perhaps even an illusion and unreality. When we have once got rid of our confinement to this lower status, we are apt to seize on the other side of the same erroneous relation between self and world. We tend to regard this eternity, which we increasingly are, in which we live, as the sole reality, and begin to look down from it upon the world and man as a remote illusion and unreality. Because that is a status quite opposite, that is a status quite opposite to our new foundation, in which we no longer place our roots of consciousness, from which we have been lifted up and transfigured, and with which we seem to have no longer any binding link. So from the poise of the self, you look back to the world, nothing binds you. When you are in the world, everything around you is binding. There are things which bind you more or less. But from there, nothing binds you to the world. So what's your connection? It seems almost remote. And it is the very opposite to our new foundation. We have no roots in this world, unstable change anymore. So as an analogy, if you were on a ship, there's a great storm. The waves come, the ship is rocking. As part of the domain of the relativity of the waves, your ship is part of the relativity and it moves, shakes, the wind blows, the waves, and it's drifting. You cannot choose where you want to be. At some point, you throw the anchor. The anchor drags on the bed of the sea until it gets stuck in the mud or in the rock. And at that point, the ship moves a bit as the current or the wind changes, but it can never move too far. It cannot continue to drift. And you say, now we are rooted, we are anchored in what? Bedrock, permanent, something. We are no more so dependent on the relativity, though we are affected by it. Now consider a situation where the ship has the means to go under the waves. So it's let's say a floating submarine now. It's able to shut the hatch and sink down below the waves. Now we are free of the waves. Go all the way to the bedrock and sit on the bedrock. Nothing bothers you. Completely free. And you look at those waves, you look at the wind and say, doesn't matter. The biggest storm doesn't affect us. In fact, this silence is so wonderful. I'm happy to be here. If you were to do the same thing in terms of consciousness, you as if go back into silence of the self, then the gap is so great that you may even forget the surface waves. They seem so thin and so irrelevant. And the analogy here is similar to the light being projected on a screen. You see, you have a projection of a movie. The light is coming on the surface of the wall. You can put all the light you want, the wall doesn't change. But if the wall wasn't there, the light could never play on it. You would never have a picture. Light picture is possible because wall exists. Wall does not care whether picture comes or not. Which is true, which is untrue, which is real, which is mutable, less real. It's very obvious. If at least the light laid an image on the wall, you would say, all right, there's some relationship. When you stop the light, there's nothing. The wall is exactly as it was. When the light is shining for the wall, it makes no difference. Against that perfect immutable reality, it looks unreal. Now the waves are just a temporary appearance. You could turn away and ignore it and it would cease to exist for you, literally. So on the other side, how do we get to that? He makes a very interesting comment. When we have once got rid of our confinement to this lower status, we are apt to seize on the other side of the same erroneous relation. This is a confinement, it's a narrowing, it's a limitation. The moment one gets free from it, it is this vast, free, wonderful, infinite awareness. But the relation between self and world is still erroneous. This way it was erroneous, now that way also it is erroneous. Especially is this likely to happen if we have made the finding of the eternal self not only our primary, but our one and absorbing objective in the withdrawal from the lower triplicity. So it's possible to approach the self with an exclusive focus or with a semi-exclusive focus. And especially if we have made that our primary goal and our one absorbing objective when we withdraw from the lower false identification, then we have this tendency. For then we are likely to shoot at once from pure mind to pure spirit, without treading the stairs between this middle and that summit. And we tend to fix on our consciousness the profound sense of a gulf which we cannot bridge and can no longer cross over again except by a painful fall. So here is the key problem. The moment you make that your all-absorbing goal, to enter into self and silence self and withdraw from this mutable appearance, you go straight. You were in pure mind as you turned up, and you break out, you are in pure spirit of self. And in between is this huge gap. And from there, if you say, all right, now I need to re-engage with the world, I need to be able to interact with things, get back my responsibilities in the world, snap, you fall back, and you're back in this domain, and the self fades. Or it's living, but there's a huge gap, but there's no link in between. And this is the most common form in which existing traditions have been relating self with mind and life. Sri Aurobindo makes this comment, without treading the stairs from this middle and that summit. There are stairs in between. We could have gone step by step instead of stepping out, shooting through, falling back. In the traditional Vedantic teaching, they will give this analogy. Self is like the sky, fully lit, vast, infinite one. Human being, human consciousness is like the mountain. The top part of the mountain where you have the snow is your mind, or even the highest peak of the mind. Pure, bare, idealistic, rarefied in its thinking, dwelling on God, on self. But between this and the sky is this huge gulf nothing can cross. All you can hope for is for the light of the self to reflect, and when it reflects most on the snowy peaks of the high abstraction of the mind. But the lower levels, they are dull, dark, absorbing the light. That's the best you can get to. You get to this and you snap out, you're in self, you stop bothering with the world. Very simple. But Sri Aurobindo points out that there is a staircase. We just chose to skip it by an exclusive focus. The problem of this jump is not only you can't bridge these two, you cannot enter worldly life without losing something of the self, without falling back into your ignorance. And you cannot explain where this world came from if it is so unreal and false. You're stuck with some strange idea of some deceptive power which created it, created an illusion, and so on. But there's a gap between that and this. Where did this power come from? And you can keep on questioning, you don't have an answer. Eventually they say, that's how it is. So stop arguing, get out of it. But it doesn't solve the problem. And the way Sri Aurobindo approaches it, he not only maps out the staircase, but the problem is resolved. So now we look at this. This was the earlier position. What's the new position? But the self and the world are in an eternal close relation. And there is a connection between them, not a gulf that has to be overleaped. So first he is affirming simply, there is an eternal close relation. Spirit and material existence are highest and lowest rung of an orderly and progressive series. Therefore, between the two, there must be a real relation and principle of connection by which the eternal Brahman is able to be at once pure spirit and self, and yet hold in himself the universe of himself. So first he is simply saying this, that these are highest and lowest rung. In between is a progressive series, progressing from here to there. And it's very orderly, very structured. There's a very clear pattern and structure there. Evidence for this you will find in extensive detail in the Life Divine. There's a chapter called the Ascending Series of Substance, where it takes up this very question and develops it over some almost 10 pages. The point he makes there, very simply, if you observe carefully the nature of matter and life energy and mind and the gradations of consciousness, you will see a clear progression. Each step higher is more plastic, more free, more interpenetrating, and less narrow. The other way, as you go down, it becomes more narrow, more less aware, more dark, dull, resistant, fixed. And so you have a series. And he takes you step by step, logically, showing you how it goes all the way to the self, where you have complete freedom and complete unity in infinity. And on the other extreme, there is complete binding in matter, complete separation in division, and finiteness. And in between is a continuity of ascending series of substance. So here we don't go too much into the details of that. We recognize that there is a progressive and orderly structure. But between the two, there must be a real relation, because we're looking for what is the relationship and principle of connection by which the eternal Brahman is able to be at once pure spirit and self, and yet hold in himself the universe of himself. The nature of Brahman is this. He is also above, transcending space and time, beyond the Big Bang. At the same time, he takes a poise where he is the originator of the Big Bang space-time form, and he is equally immanent inside all form and the totality of the universe. And he is able to be simultaneously in the whole. Now, if he can do it, there must be something common across all this. That he can be in self and spirit, and yet he can hold the universe, which is himself. And there is a continuity in him. So this is our starting point. Once we recognize that Brahman is able to do this, then, he says, and it must be possible for the soul that is one with or in union with the eternal to adopt the same poise of divine relation in place of our present ignorant immersion in the world. So rather than being in this ignorant immersion as a fragment struggling, we can identify with that poise with which Brahman shares his awareness of the world and embraces the world in himself, and the world is made of himself. And if he can take that poise, we can also gain that poise. Now here's the important part. We identifying with the eternal and with the Brahman can take any number of poises that the Brahman experiences. Right now we are focusing on this one particular poise. There is also the poise of Brahman which says, I am beyond all limitation. Nothing can bind me, nothing can limit me, and just shoots into a transcendence. In that poise, the whole world fades out. Relativities fade out. And there's this other part where the Brahman says, I am that which transcends everything and includes all things that it transcends. And all things which I transcend pour out of me. And still I am free of them. And that's the poise where he looks out on the relativities and infinite possibility of his own being, holds them, knows them, and yet stays free of them while engaging with them. That's the poise that we are interested in. In the next chapter, which is titled The Modes of the Self, Sri Aurobindo describes how we must not only regain this right relationship with the world, but we must know all of the modes in which the Brahman knows himself. That also is an integral realization which we must aim at. So that becomes another chapter. This chapter is dedicated to the relationship with the world. So rereading this sentence, and it must be possible for the soul that is one with or in union with the eternal to adopt the same poise of divine relation in place of our present ignorant immersion in the world. That would mean practically that we could be in the body, mind, life, operating completely with all capacities that we have currently and perhaps more, and still remain in that poise of Brahman which is free. And in such a condition, as we act, we would act not from this narrow center of I, but from the poise of the freedom flowing through this focal point of action, and all our action would be free of consequence. It would be able to express the freedom of the Creator while being inside the creation. This is an extraordinary idea. He will come to that shortly. And what it means is, you act. On the surface, you may be doing everything necessary in a normal human life, and perhaps more. But as you act, there are no consequences or bindings to your action. This is the point which Sri Krishna makes in the Bhagavad Gita. He says, when you act from immersion in me, in the divine consciousness, then you are free from the consequences of karma. Your method of action itself does not have reaction because you are in a consciousness which is non-reactive and transcends all the reactive parts which are your own parts, your own being. Look at it this way. If I am sitting next to somebody, I give him a knock. There will be a reaction, he will hit me back because we are two separate people. But if I give myself a knock, I don't have to react. I choose not to react to myself. Right? So when one lives in a consciousness in which the whole universe is held as yourself, you act, let's say a knock upon something, some part of the whole. Your action is all encompassing. It includes the full awareness of the cosmos, is in perfect harmony with the whole cosmos because it knows everything. As when I hit myself, I'm in full harmony with that with which I'm hitting because I'm myself both and fully aware of both. When I clap, I align my hands perfectly to make the best sound. Okay, so it's a hit, but there's no reaction. This side doesn't get upset. And so there's a relationship with the whole world as you act in a narrow focus, and the ripples which flow can be either your self-chosen ripples that you choose, or which you choose to absorb or cancel, or have no ripples at all. Smooth action in the same way the divine manifests. When the divine manifests, there is nothing other which can oppose. So the movement of the manifestation is effortless, without opposition and without strain or struggle. Strain or struggle happens when something is opposing. I have to push against a resistance, but there is no other, there is only me. So as I move, I flow effortlessly. That's the way the divine manifests, creates the universe. And when you identify with this poise of the consciousness, your action flows in the same way. Now we're coming to the principle. What is the principle when seen from this poise of relationship? This principle of connection is the eternal unity between the self and all existences. Of that eternal unity, the liberated soul must be capable, just as the ever free and unbound divine is capable of it. And that we should realize equally with the pure self-existence at which we have first to aim. So, the divine has experiences of unity with all things, all of its creation, all things that exist. So, eternal unity between the self and all existences. The unity is not changing. It did not appear one day. It does not develop. It was always there because everything was Himself released, launching, expanding, so to say. It was always there. It is that principle that we catch. On that principle now, the whole relationship with the world is going to be rebuilt. And as we aim at the realization of the pure self-existence, it is this which we should aim to realize equally. So even as we focus our attention on realizing the consciousness of one which is infinite, supporting all things, we aim also to realize that this consciousness is in unity with all things. And so this we should build upon as the first foundation, at which we have first to aim. And later from this we will build further other relationships. For the integral self-possession for the integral self-possession, we must be one not only with the self, with God, but with all existences. Remember, the goal is an integral realization. So not only with self, but all existences of self also should be part of that. We must take back in the right relation and in the poise of an eternal truth the world of our manifested existence, peopled by our fellow beings, from which we had to draw back because we were bound to them in a wrong relation and in the poise of a falsehood created in time by the principle of a divided consciousness with all its oppositions, discords and dualities. So we were in a wrong relation, in a divided consciousness. Consequence there was that there was falsehood, there was opposition, discord, duality. When something is wrongly aligned, there will always be a conflict. Consider two gears of a clock. When they're perfectly meshed, they can move smoothly as if one didn't exist against the other. There's no resistance, no opposition. But the moment you have it out of sync, at each step something is crashing against another, blocking, getting stuck. That's our relationship with others around us and with the world. But once there is a falsehood in the relationship, there is opposition, discord, misalignments, and dualities. Everything, for every action that you do, there is an opposite which opposes or which hits back. And this being the wrong relation, we have to draw back from it. And now from this new poise, we are trying to re-establish a right relation in the poise of an eternal truth. The whole world has to be taken back. So, first requirement was to get to a consciousness in which that is possible, in which the right relation exists, that is of unity. From there now we are going to re-establish the right relation. We have to take back all things and beings into our new consciousness, but as one with all, not divided from them by an egoistic individuality. So from this poise, as the consciousness turns to look at the world and experiences the underlying unity, everything is myself that I take back into me. So first there was a withdrawal, a turning around, and now a re-embracement on a new foundation. Now remember, we started by saying that something of this happens on all levels at each step of our development. When we awaken to some sense of the psychic presence in us, or an experience of unity with the psychic being, you turn back and look at the world and you suddenly see everything as being so beautiful, so full of the divine presence, so full of consciousness. Everything resonates with love, with beauty, with the sense of the sacred. And even your favorite enemy whom you love to hate is also this glow of divinity and light, and everything is magical. Sometimes we have a glimpse of this when we are alone in nature and the psychic presence comes forward, or at other times, in whatever way, we now look upon the world and everything is recast. All relationships are re-established on a new foundation. But the same thing can happen also at a lesser level in a mental consciousness. And I will draw back on the example which I have given earlier, 2 sessions ago, when I spoke of this person who said he was practicing looking at the world the way the universe would look at things, looking at his own life the way the universe would look at it. And it's a mental exercise. You start looking at things impersonally, not from my personal angle, my personal interest. But I look at things from a third point, third party, as if the sky looking down at all these people working. I have an ongoing tussle and conflict with X or Y or Z. You look from the poise of the sky and you see this as so petty, so trivial, so superficial. When after all, we are all part of one humanity working together for a common purpose. And when you start looking at it, suddenly the thing which is bothering you in that tussle, that fades out. It's irrelevant, doesn't matter. I meet that person and it's as if the problem is gone, at least from my side. And when I begin to engage from a consciousness where I do not have any more this tension or conflict, perhaps from his side also the response begins to change and a new rhythm, a new relationship begins to grow, and with all things in this way. I walk into the forest, every tree here has been here longer than my body has been on earth. Each tree is at least 100 years old. They have so much wisdom, they know so much. Family. And if at all I need some firewood to light a fire because I'm cold in the evening, well, I will ask my trees permission. Can I take a little bit? And I know exactly how much to take, that I do not break the balance and I do not harm them in a certain way. And perhaps if my alignment is perfect, as I walk into the forest, I find the twigs necessary, just as needed for that day, for that night. I bring it together and I act. And I'm in constant conscious harmony. And this is not from the self, this is purely from the mind beginning to look at things differently. And this is well within reach of all of us. A little bit of practice, a little bit of effort and exercise. When the same thing happens from the self, it has a far greater depth, profundity and reality. You not only experience the trees as your brothers, you experience them as yourself. They are myself as tree, myself as beetle, myself as bird. And when I reach out and I have to do something to take the fruit from the tree, I have literally the feeling that I am catching myself as I catch the fruit and pluck. And all that the trees experience, I experience in myself as an extension of myself. So you can see how a dwelling on this, even in mind, has a massive shift practically in our relationship with all things. And so from this new consciousness, even from the mental poise, we have to take back all things and beings into our new consciousness, but as one with all, not divided from them by an egoistic individuality. Now from this poise, and I'm not speaking of self, from the mind's perspective, looking from above, the way the sky looks at things. What is this person, this little ego? It's no different from that or from that. One can even in the extreme say that beetle is as much important as this person that I used to call myself. And everything in the world is as important. That stone which is falling there is as much content to be there and rightly placed there as I am in my place. And so in this way, when we re-embrace the world from the poise of self, in other words, besides the consciousness of the transcendent self, pure, self-existent, timeless, spaceless, we have to accept and become the cosmic consciousness. We have to identify our being with the infinite, who makes himself the base and continent of the worlds and dwells in all existences. So there's one poise which is the self, self-existent, pure, timeless, spaceless. And then from there, the cosmic consciousness identifying with all that makes the base of all things, on which, so to say, the foam, the waves of the sea happen, and the continent of the worlds. It holds, contains, and dwells in all existences. So there are three poises. One which is above, pure, bare, free, unchanging, timeless, spaceless. Then that leans, supporting as if in a base, the whole time, space, form, movement of the ocean. And then that enters into the time, space, form of all things. There's a triple status. This is the realization which the ancient Vedantins spoke of as seeing all existences in the self and the self in all existences. And in addition, they speak of the crowning realization of the man in whom the original miracle of existence has been repeated. Self-being has become all these existences that belong to the world of the becoming. In these three terms is expressed fundamentally the whole of that real relation between the self and the world, which we have to substitute for the false relation created by the limiting ego. So now we have the full definition of the relationship in three terms. So, first is all existences in the self. You look at the flower, you look at the tree, you look at the bird. All of these are inside this self which is containing and holding everything. Much like you see the fish in the ocean. It's swimming, but without the ocean it couldn't exist. It is ocean which holds and contains it. The second term is seeing the self in all existences. So while the fish is swimming in the ocean, the water of the ocean is inside the body of the fish and is the substance out of which the fish body is formed. So we look at these trees, these birds, these animals and insects. Yes, they're all inside the ocean of self, but the self is inside them equally and in each one of them uniquely. And then in addition, there is a third realization which he describes as the crowning realization of the man in whom the original miracle of existence has been repeated. In other words, what was the original miracle of existence? When out of the self, unchanging, eternal, spaceless, timeless one, there was this miraculous appearance of things which are bound in space, time, limitation, form, distinctions, etc., which is miraculous. How can something which is indivisible appear as divided form? How can something which has no space and time appear in form of space and time and develop causality of relationships when it is utterly free? That's a miracle. And that original miracle of existence has been repeated in this person. And that's why it is the crowning of the realization. You are as if one with the creative experience of the divine when the world is born. And in you it is as if the whole world is being reborn at this moment. And this is an extraordinary thing. In a way, if you looked at it from a different perspective, in the universe, the whole universe is experiencing the rebirth, of the Big Bang through this one individual. Except it is not an explosive Big Bang, it is not a reforming, but in the consciousness it is a re-establishment of everything, re-embracing everything. The whole universe is as if reborn in you. Self-being has become all these existences that belong to the worlds of the becoming. I am become the tree, the plant, the bird, the animal, all these human beings. In these three terms is expressed fundamentally the whole of that real relationship between the self and the world, which we have to substitute for the false relation created by the limiting ego. This is the new vision and the sense of infinite being which we have to acquire. This, the foundation of that unity with all which we have to establish. So this vision has to be acquired, this unity has to be established, and in this consciousness, we are simultaneously in that state of liberation, completely free of all things in transcendence, perhaps even dwelling in the sense of the Absolute, while still containing and entering and experiencing the whole. Is this possible? Very simply, he says in the next paragraph, for our self, for our real self, is not the individual mental being. That is only a figure and appearance. Our real self is cosmic, infinite. It is one with all existence and the inhabitant of all existences. The self behind our mind, life and body is the same as the self behind the mind, life and body of all our fellow beings. And if we come to possess it, we shall naturally, when we turn to look out again upon them, tend to become one with them in the common basis of our consciousness. And this being the truth of things, yes, there are resistances. When you turn back, you still have the old body, life, mind. They have not changed. They may oppose, they may resist this re-embracement. They may offer old habits and tendencies. How you deal with that is something which we will see next time. But this was always the truth of things. Remember, it was subliminal in our higher, deeper, or perhaps highest and deepest parts. But now we have awakened to it and through it recovered that true relationship. Now, any movement of the mind, any movement of the heart, or any movement of our life actions which drifts towards this truth is helping us grow towards it. When you reach out to an unknown person, as if a friend who is in need, and you reach out and help. When you feel empathy, sympathy, family feeling with others, whether real family or strangers is irrelevant. You are growing in this direction. When in your mind you have some sense of altruism, wanting to help, wanting to do good to others, wanting to change the circumstances so that everyone may grow and benefit, you are reflecting this deep truth. But in all of these reflected actions, who is making the effort? It's still the sense of I am separate from them. But because that is the deepest truth of things, it is possible for us to experience this. Because that is the deepest truth of things, it is like a magnet which pulls us towards this kind of behavior. And that is why all development of culture and of civilization is a moving towards this. And that is why inevitably all organization of human life will tend towards some kind of an underlying expression of unity. But as long as the true unity, the true foundation is not discovered, these will be approximations. They will break down at some stage. They will become insufficient under certain extremes. And so there is a frustration. I had such great idealism. We had such great idealism. We built something so wonderful. And then because of this one little thing, the whole thing broke apart. Because we were not really founded on the true consciousness, but something in between. But in the process, we have come closer to a true consciousness. Now, in the yoga, rather than going through intermediate steps and struggling, we make effort to go as quickly as possible to as true a consciousness as possible, and then from there start rebuilding. So this was the nature of the effort in the early years of the ashram. So for that purpose, you will see, in the ashram, we were forbidden to have any other human relations with anybody other than what was minimally required for the work. All our relations were put exclusively with the divine, and in particular in the form of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, who were the Guru. And to establish oneness with the divine was the first priority. On the basis of that oneness, a rebuilding of the collective life would take place. So the focus was to get as quickly as possible to that highest station. From there, rebuild, recast our relationships. During that initial phase, though, we minimized all external relationships, minimized them to whatever degree practically necessary. We did not withdraw from life. We were very much in life, but the life itself was made a field for manifesting that higher truth, to recast our relationships with world, with matter, with the reality of things. So you will see everywhere Mother attempted to bring the higher truths, and especially the truths of the immediate future necessary for humanity in its evolution. When first, and she shied away from nothing. She started businesses, took up the domain of arts, technologies, engineering, sciences, everything. Nothing was left out. And when first the business was started, she named it honesty, which is the principle most required for business to become a vehicle for a divine manifestation and organization. And so it was that she built everything. In Auroville, the first school which was created, she called it Last School. Okay, so people were supposed to get the message. It was difficult. Human beings are a little resistant. Okay, they built the next school and they went to Mother and said, another name, Mother. She said, after school. So last school is finished, now you are after school. And then the third was created, and Mother named it No School. Imagine a school called No School. And the message was very clear. The schools as we knew them as factories for manufacturing human beings, it was ended. And here we were going beyond that to something new. But of course human beings struggle to put that into practice. They don't know what to do. The attempt, though, you see, soared to getting something at the highest and then rebuilding from there. And it was possible when they were in the physical body that they could carry us in that way. In practice, though, the principle still continues. Especially when we are in a community framework like this, where everybody is to some degree conscious of this sense of purpose, it's possible to continue to live like that, to whatever degree practically limited, but nothing prevents you internally in your consciousness from making this effort. One does not have to cut off in isolation entirely. As I said before, at each stage of our current development in consciousness, we turn upon, recast our relationships. But at the very least, after having read this, we can already begin to review things from our mental consciousness in these terms. We may not feel it immediately, but at least we can understand this is the truth. It is the self underlying. The self behind your mind, life and body is the same self as behind my mind, life and body. And therefore we are both special projections of each of the same one self. All of us special tail ends of God. We can describe God as a creature with many tails, billions of tails, tail ends. And all these tail ends are meeting each other as different beings and getting into conflict with each other. So this triple terms catches the whole of the right relation between the self and the world, which we have to substitute for the false relation created by the limiting ego. This is a reference straight to the Isha Upanishad. He puts the footnote of the Isha Upanishad, where we have two verses which capture this triple relationship, and we can briefly read that. Verse number 6, Sri Aurobindo's translation. But he who sees everywhere the self in all existences, and all existences in the self, shrinks not thereafter from aught. Shrinks from nothing once you begin to see that. Second, the verse number 7. He in whom it is the self-being that has become all existences, that are becomings of the self. He in whom it is the self-being that has become all existences, that are becomings. For he has the perfect knowledge. How shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have grief who sees everywhere oneness? So there is no delusion here, because you are no more seeing falsified appearances. You are seeing things for what they are, which is all are forms and expressions of oneself. There are a few sonnets in which experiences in these directions have been expressed. I would like to read from two of them and then we can close today. So the first one is titled Cosmic Consciousness. I have wrapped the wide world in my wider self, and time and space my spirit's seeing are. I am the god and demon, ghost and elf. I am the wind's speed and the blazing star. All nature is the nursling of my care, like a child that you are nursing. All nature is the nursling of my care. I am the struggle and the eternal rest. The world's joy thrilling runs through me. I bear the sorrow of millions in my lonely breast. I have learned a close identity with all, yet am by nothing bound that I become. Carrying in me the universe's call, I mount to my imperishable home. I pass beyond time and life on measureless wings, yet still am one with born and unborn things. So there is simultaneously this transcendence and then this immanence, and at the same time the sorrow of millions he carries, at the same time the thrilling joy runs through him. Everything is as if in himself. There is So there's another which is similar. The cosmic spirit. I am a single self, all nature fills. Immeasurable, unmoved, the witness sits. He is the silence brooding on her hills, the circling motion of her cosmic mights. I have broken the limits of embodied mind and am no more the figure of a soul. The burning galaxies are in me outlined. The universe is my stupendous whole. My life is the life of village and continent. I am Earth's agony and her throbs of bliss. I share all creatures' sorrow and content, and feel the passage of every stab and kiss. Impassive, I bear each act and thought and mood. Time traverses my hushed infinitude. There is another where he describes how he sees himself in all things, but I don't get it now, it doesn't matter. So I think we'll pause here. Any questions or any comments? We can take them up now. I think we can dwell on this, meditate on this for a while. And it is a very important passage, and to reread it and to dwell on this idea of what he has described as the three terms of the real relationship between the self and the world. To think about it, to dwell on it, even to sit in silence and in your mind perceive this, visualize this, helps the mind to acclimatize and to accustom to this perspective of things. And one can do it in the midst of our work. If you are in a narrow focus, I have the flowers, I have the objects on my desk, bring that sense of the one presence of the self which fills all things. If you're in a wider space, looking at the people, buildings, forest around you, hills, ocean, then you can bring the sense of all things in that vast presence, and which is sky and beyond sky in the universe. And just this idea that that which becomes you is the same that becomes each of these forms. And some part of you, deep within, high above, is one with that which manifests as the whole universe, of which we are the tail end, the tip, the front. Just that idea. And when we dwell on this, and the idea becomes normal, you will find with this, your perspective of things, life, values and relationships will undergo a sea change. So this is a practical form in which we can take this up in the coming weeks. And we continue this next Friday. Oh.